The town of Black Hollow had always been surrounded by dense, ancient woods. Legends whispered of an entity that watched from the shadows, a silent figure with hollow eyes that followed those who dared wander too deep. Most dismissed it as mere folklore, but for Thomas Grayson, the legend became horrifyingly real. Thomas had returned to Black Hollow after years away, hoping to reclaim the quiet solitude of his childhood home. The house, nestled at the forest's edge, had been left untouched since his grandfather's passing. The first few nights were uneventful until he noticed something peculiar. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint shuffling sound came from the trees. At first, he attributed it to wildlife, but soon he realized it was something else. The sounds were deliberate, calculated, a rhythmic crunching of leaves inching closer each night. One evening, armed with nothing but a flashlight, Thomas decided to investigate. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the kind that clung to your skin. As he ventured deeper, he saw them. Footprints. Not just any footprints. These were elongated, as if the toes stretched too far, digging into the mud like claws. A shiver crept down his spine as he heard the crunching sound again. Swinging his flashlight toward the source, he saw nothing but dense trees swaying in the wind. But then, the beam caught something, two hollow, white eyes staring at him from between the trunks. Frozen in place, he felt a wave of dread crash over him. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Thomas took a step back, and the figure mirrored him. His breathing grew ragged. Another step back. Another step forward from the figure. Without warning, the wind howled through the trees, and the figure lunged. Thomas bolted, heart pounding like a war drum. Branches clawed at his face as he ran, the sound of something sprinting behind him growing louder. The porch light of his house was a beacon in the darkness, and with a final desperate push, he leaped onto the steps, slamming the door behind him. Silence. Panting, he pressed his ear against the door. Nothing. Just the sound of his own ragged breath. Minutes passed, and slowly, cautiously, he peered through the window. The figure stood at the tree line, unmoving, watching. That night, Thomas didn't sleep, nor the next. The pattern continued. Every night, the figure inched closer. First at the edge of the trees, then the clearing, then the porch steps. On the fifth night, he woke to find the front door ajar. His stomach dropped. Something had been inside. The realization sent him into a frenzy. He grabbed his keys, packed a bag, and bolted for his car. As he turned the ignition, his headlights illuminated the driveway, and his blood ran cold. The figure stood directly in front of the car. Pale, featureless face mere inches from the hood. His head tilted slightly, as if curious. Thomas couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, it took a step forward. That was all it took. Slamming the car into reverse, he tore down the road, never looking back. He drove until the forest disappeared from the rearview mirror, until Black Hollow was just a distant nightmare. Years later, Thomas still dreams of it. The hollow eyes, the slow approach. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he swears he hears the faint sound of crunching leaves just outside his window. But the nightmare didn't truly end. As the years passed, Thomas found it impossible to ignore the paranoia that clung to him like a second skin. He moved across the country, changed his name, and avoided the woods at all costs. But no matter how far he ran, he could never shake the feeling that something was watching. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, a familiar sense of unease crept over him. The air grew heavy, the silence too deep. He walked to the window, glancing down at the street below. Empty. But then, there, in the shadows of the alley across the street, a pair of hollow, white eyes stared back at him. His breath hitched. It had found him. Thomas slammed the blinds shut and backed away from the window. His mind raced. He hadn't spoken of Black Hollow in years. How could it possibly have followed him? His chest tightened as he heard a soft, deliberate tapping at the glass. He refused to look. That night, sleep did not come. Hours passed as he sat in the corner of his bedroom, heart thudding in his chest. When the first light of dawn seeped through the blinds, he cautiously approached the window. Slowly, he lifted the slats. Nothing. The alley was empty. Had he imagined it? Days went by, and he forced himself to believe it was his mind playing tricks. But then, one evening, as he stepped into his dimly lit hallway, he froze. The front door was ajar. A breath of cold air slithered through the gap, sending a chill down his spine. He reached out with trembling fingers and pushed it closed, locking it tight. But as he turned away, a single, unmistakable sound echoed from behind him. Crunch. The sound of footsteps on dead leaves. Inside the apartment, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Thomas backed up, his pulse hammering in his ears. His only escape was the bedroom, but he knew, deep down, there was no running. No hiding. It had found him. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned. The last thing he saw were those hollow, white eyes staring from the darkness of his own home. And then, the lights went out.